Saucier, and I am glad to be here and represent the Olympic College Foundation and welcome you to tonight's speech. You didn't come here, though, to hear me. What you came was to hear our presentation. So let me just tell you that I was given information about Dr. Paul Ortiz that ran to a curriculum vitae that was 27 pages. I printed off 5 of them, so stick with me here. Our speaker this evening is the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and associate professor at the Department of History at the University of Florida. We get that off of page 1. Paul has his doctorate in history from Duke University, his Bachelor of Arts from Evergreen State College, and before he went to Evergreen, he is an Olympic College alumnus. Not only is he an Olympic College alumnus, he is a distinguished alumnus and he was featured in one of our newsletters. You may have noticed or read that before. And then I just want to share with you one last bit. Paul Ortiz sounds like an academic in a lovely white tower, and this academic really has done other things as well, for he is a vet of the U.S. Army Airborne Division and Special Forces Group in Central America, and a winner of a variety of medals and Dad's Score sets, including my personal favorite, for no good reason, the Venezuelan diving badge. So with that, I want to tell you that I'm introducing you to one of the many reasons that I am personally proud to have any recognition or any affiliation with Olympic College at all, which I had for over 37 years. I get to introduce Dr. Paul Ortiz.
Thank you, Ruth, a very kind introduction. Thank you so much for having me back, for welcoming me back to this amazing, transformational campus. For me, this is really where it began, my journey into higher education, into a career in history. I have the best family, the best friends, the best teachers who are here with us tonight in this room. And when you speak in public, one of the first things you learn is never start acknowledging people in the audience because you will forget someone, right? But again, apropos of the event tonight, I do want to acknowledge this group of troublemakers to my left, these incredible professors and teachers, Don Bidwell, the best English teacher in the United States of America, Phil Schaefer, the person who first put the idea in my head of becoming a historian. Imagine that. Robert Erickson, who was an incredible role model, and I told him, I had the privilege of telling him I still have all of the notes I took in his class from back in the day, and David Toren, who I recall coming into class, political philosophy, education, lecturing perfectly barefoot. And what they taught me was teaching and history and scholarship should be rigorous, but it should be fun. It should be something you can pay the bills with, but it should be meaningful. It should be giving back to society. It should be improving the life of the community. And those goals of combining civic engagement and scholarship, rigorous research and teaching, I learned all that stuff here at the Olympic College. And I'm also proud to say that my sister and niece, who are in attendance this evening as well, are also Olympic College graduates. So I hope you will consider us part of your family. The talk tonight is, and Ruth may have picked this title, she's much better at titles than I am, but the idea of making history matter in 2018. Talking to Phil Schaefer before the event started this evening, David Torn, Robert Erickson, Don Bidwell, and others, we live in a crisis moment in the society. I could point out many elements of the crisis. One of them was a poll, a little studied poll that came out in the fall. And it was commissioned by, I believe, CNBC, one of the major networks. And the poll revealed the fact that nearly 10% of Americans believe that Nazi beliefs, National Socialist beliefs, are okay, are just fine. Nearly 10%. That represents well over 20 million people. That's part of the crisis that we live in today, and that's one of the reasons why history is so very important. I grew up in Bremerton, Washington, with survivors of German POW camps. And if anyone would have talked Nazi nonsense around them, I can tell you what would have happened. But we've forgotten, right? Part of the strong point of the society that we live in, part of the great thing about being an American is we're forward thinking, we're optimistic, we're entrepreneurial. But one of the deficits is, and it's a huge deficit by the way, we forget quickly. We forget where we've come from. We often forget what our parents did to make a living. It's quite amazing. And for all these reasons, oral history is so very important. I wanted to talk tonight about the craft of oral history and public history, and how throughout the country and really throughout the world, the craft and the practice of oral history, both university-based oral history centers like the one that I direct at the University of Florida, but also independent oral history programs, museums, online exhibits. You'll see oral history being practiced all over the world, and it's really on the ascendancy in many ways. How many of you listen to StoryCorps? Okay, quite a few. So that's one brand, one very important version of of oral history. So instead of having a scholar or a student interview someone, family members interview each other. And it's a very powerful kind of subjective take on history. And I use the term subjective very instrumentally because oral history, in fact, is a subjective type of research. What I mean by this is that if I go and interview a Holocaust survivor or a veteran of the D-Day Normandy landings in World War II, or a survivor of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York in 2001, I want to ask them about their experiences and what it meant to them and what it was like to be there. I'm not going to ask them, oh, take a step back and think objectively about what it was like to be there in that camp or on that battlefield. That's my job as a historian. What we're trying to get in oral history is the subjective qualities of life. And as a historian, historians always complain that our students, we can teach them dates and events, but we can't get out of them, well, what did it mean to be there? What did this event mean? What did it mean to be there at the opening of World War II? What did it mean to be there at the end? What did it mean to hear that an atomic bomb had just been dropped on this faraway place in Japan? So that's what I mean by subjectivity, the importance of subjective knowledge in oral history. So what I'm going to do tonight is to take you through some of the projects that we do at the University of Florida and explain and talk a little bit about oral history and then open it up for some questions and really have a dialogue about the importance of history in this day and age. So this is the homepage for the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and if everything works here, I'm actually going to play some clips for you from our collections. One of the great things about oral history is that we can go back in time and not only interview people, but we provide our students with so many different great skill sets in digital production, both audio and video, podcasting, documentary making. And we also are in the process of digitizing a lot of older materials that are in danger of being lost. So one of the main things that the students and staff and volunteers at the Oral History Program at UF is collect material. This is one example. In 1971, a young undergraduate filmmaker by the name of Churchill Roberts, who had matriculated from Tennessee, got in his head to do a documentary film on the Memphis sanitation workers' strike in 1968. And those of you who know U.S. history and African American history and labor history know that this is one of the most important strikes in American history. This is a strike that Dr. King personally participated in, came to Memphis, knew he was risking his life, and in fact was assassinated in Memphis, standing in solidarity with 1,300 striking garbage workers. And so this nondescript, totally anonymous filmmaker by the name of Churchill Roberts just did a documentary on it. And it just sat on the shelf for 40 years. And one of the skill sets our students learn in oral history is how to and the archivists in the room will know this quite well, is how to recover and restore and repair old analog material. So we had this film and we actually restored it, digitized it, and now it's available. And you can watch it, and it takes you back to 1968. And it has found footage of Dr. King speaking, the last speech he ever made, and it's very powerful. And so it's one of the things we do in the oral history world in addition to interviewing, is we do a lot of this work now. Another recording that we recently restored and recovered was a panel that took place in the University of Florida in 1981, a discussion between James Baldwin and Chinua Achebe, two of the greatest novelists in the world, and someone had just somehow recorded them. And they came into our program one day and said, hey, we have this old reel-to-reel, can you do something with it? And I'm like, well, how's it labeled? Oh, James Baldwin and Chinua Achebe. I'm like, okay, let's look at it, okay? So it's really cool. Let me just introduce you to Mr. Clayton. So, like I said, I can give you a lecture on the Vietnam War. I know a lot about the war. I studied it, but I didn't fight in that war. That was not my war. I was in Central America. But we have interviewed so many Vietnam veterans and my goal in the program is to put our students in contact with these individuals, train them how to do the interview. And how we do this is we have them do a lot of reading, a lot of research. We're not going to send them out to interview a Vietnam War veteran or a civil rights activist or a retired school teacher without the student first doing research. What did that person teach? What theaters did they serve in? What business did they run? When did they become the first female council member in their town? What was it like? So in other words, getting them prepared to do the interview. But putting the students in direct contact with a Vietnam War veteran, you're going to hear this clip, and you're going to hear a student interviewing a man who I've known for many years. And I'll give you a little context. Cornelius Clayton was a combat veteran in the Vietnam War. He was a mortarman. And one day his unit came under attack by North Vietnamese mortarmen. And because Cornelius knew the craft of putting fire down on people, he understood what was happening to his unit. And he understood that very soon, many of the men who he was serving with would be dead. And I'll play the clip for you.
I mean, we were real tight. We shared things from state. You know, if somebody got some goodies from, like, canned their cookies or something from state, we always shared. And they dropped another round in. So I didn't realize that I was hit in my right shoulder, small place in my left shoulder, buttocks, left eye, small fragments. Those are my biggest wounds. Can you see them?
Oh yeah, I definitely can see it.
And one that's kind of open and got infected when I got in the hospital. They had to pull the stitches and let it, so I could.
So those are shrapnel wounds.
Yeah, shrapnel wound. But when they dropped those 2 rounds, I just thought it was all over.
So it's kind of YouTube quality, but essentially this is a man who's talking about what it was like to listen to mortar shells dropping on his unit and to watch people beside him die. And to live the rest of his life with so much shrapnel in his body, he can't even go through an airport metal detector. And when we can put students in contact with people like that, then we can put them in contact with what it means to be at war, instead of just talking in abstract about it. And that's one of the reasons why I love oral history. So back to the PowerPoint. I want to take a step back for a minute and get to my newest book in African American and Latinx history of the United States. This book has taken me all across the country, and it's been animated by, again, the spirit of what I learned at Olympic College on how to make history engaging, how to make it exciting. What we need, and actually you'll be glad to know that this morning I spent 2 hours with high school students at Capitol High School in Olympia, Washington, and we just workshopped on my new book. And we talked about one chapter in particular, Reconstruction. And what I've tried to do in that is to introduce new characters to students, to make it accessible so that high school students can read this material. Reconstruction is really, if we were giving a longer lecture here, I could say it's the most important period in U.S. history. But to get students to read about Reconstruction, we have to present it a little differently. We have to give students individuals and characters that they can recognize. And so many of you know about Frederick Douglass, but fewer of us know about Francisco P. Ramirez. But he's a character who, in many ways, is one of the most important abolitionists and anti-slavery activists in early 19th century America. But he wrote most of his material in Spanish because he was a former Mexican citizen who was in the United States when the U.S. invaded Mexico, took over California, Texas, so on and so forth. One of the things that I'm hearing a lot, and on this book tour, I'm talking as much to high school students as I am to university students. And superintendents are telling me, in fact, I'm giving a talk next month to all the social studies chairs for K through 12 schools at Montgomery County, Maryland, which the superintendent tells me is the 14th largest school district in the U.S. And he told me very pointedly, he said, Professor Ortiz, do you have characters in your book that our students can actually connect to and see themselves as having affinities with, as recognizing, as getting them to think about themselves as possibly playing a part in the history? And I'm like, are you kidding me? I have tons of those characters. Because this book comes out of the classroom. And I'll show you a chapter outline in just a moment, but when I taught at UC Santa Cruz for 7 years, a lot of the students in my survey courses on U.S. history were students from Mexico, Honduras, East Africa, Russia. In other words, many immigrant students, first, second generation students, asking me over and over again, where is my people, or where are our people? You know, where are my parents or grandparents in your histories? When I moved to Florida, and I've taught at the University of Florida now for 10 years, I have tons of Cuban American students, many students from the Dominican Republic, a lot of Eastern European students, and again, they want to see themselves in the narrative, in the historical narrative. So in this new book, you'll read about Alexander Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, Jefferson, the usual cast of characters, but you're going to learn a lot more. Now, when we teach history, how to make it more exciting is like asking our students, what do these core concepts mean to you? So let me give you one example. This semester I'm teaching a Latino history class, and I asked my students, what do you think about this idea of isolationism in U.S. history? And again, remember that 2/3 of the students in that class are either Cuban American or they're from the Spanish Caribbean or another place. And they said, what do you mean by isolationism? And I said, well, You know, there are historians who argue that the U.S. was traditionally isolationist up to up to a certain period of time, maybe up to World War II, maybe World War I, maybe the Spanish-American War. And you know how my Cuban-American students respond to that? They laughed. They're like, the U.S. isolationist? The U.S. has never been isolationist from our perspectives. So part of the ways in which I've tried to write this book is to get outside of the country, to try to understand what the U.S. looks like from outside of the U.S. And I started picking up this when I was in Central America, because I would talk to folks in Honduras. By the way, Ruth, someday I'll tell you how I got that Venezuelan diving badge. That's an interesting story. But I would talk to people, and they would tell me about my own country. And they would tell me things I'd never heard of before, and that I didn't really know, but I should have known. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book, is in part making history exciting by opening up U.S. history, seeing it as an internationalist history from day one. Because that's we have Junot Diaz, who just won the Pulitzer, The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. He begins with the Dominican Republic, Columbus, Rafael Trujillo, the dictatorship from 30 to 61, supported by the U.S. I served with many people in the 82nd Airborne who took part in the invasion of the Dominican Republic. And Junot Diaz's argument as a novelist is the Dominican Republic is really should be at the center of American history, because we've had so much to do with it. And there's so many people from the Dominican Republic in the U.S. now. Like, go to Washington Heights, go to Miami-Dade, go to Orlando. So in other words, the connections between countries in the Americas is very, very important. Here's another important connection that in the course of my research, I was able to translate letters written by leaders of the Mexican War of Independence. And the Mexican-American students I have and the Latin American students I have are very excited about this, because I'm able to tell them that Mexico abolished slavery many years before the United States did. And equally important, they tried to outreach to the United States, to James Madison in this case, to actually join and be part of a hemispheric-wide alliance against European tyranny. And the way that the Mexicans broached this to James Madison and John Quincy Adams and others was said, you know, you all just finished a revolutionary war against British tyranny. We're fighting the same thing, only our enemies are the Spanish, and we're trying to end slavery. We're trying to end the oppression of indigenous people. We think if we join together, we could form a powerful alliance against the French and the British and the Spanish. And you know, all those powers are trying to get back and take stuff away from us, you know, both of our countries. Imagine what would have happened if the founding fathers would have taken that deal. History could have been much different, but it's reapproaching traditional topics and realizing how much more we have to learn about them. That makes history exciting. I mean, this material, and I had the best history teachers in the world, and I've read tons and tons of histories, but reading these letters and going back into the archives has really challenged my understanding of history and has made it much more exciting, I'm glad to say, for my students. Here was another eye-opener. In the middle of Reconstruction, that great struggle that African Americans waged to gain their right to vote, to gain public education, to gain citizenship. In the midst of this, they said, abolishing slavery in the U.S. is not enough. It's not even barely a first step. It's not time to do away with our anti-slavery societies just because the Civil War has been successfully prosecuted. You know, I grew up with the Cold War saying, Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Well, in 1865, it was still 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right? And so African Americans are saying, yeah, we want the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. We need the 14th Amendment for equal protection. We need the 15th Amendment to defend voting rights. But unless we work to abolish slavery in Cuba and Brazil And wherever else it exists, we'll never be truly free ourselves. And it was humbling for me to read this because I'm rereading convention documents from black communities that I had read in graduate school. And I thought I knew those documents when they would say, you know, equal rights, fight the Klan, fight lynching, you know, strive for equality in all areas of life. But then there was always something I missed. It was the stuff about fighting slavery in Cuba, fighting slavery in Brazil, and demanding that the U.S. government take a stance in these international conflicts. And you can imagine my students from Cuba are so excited to read this material. They're just thrilled. And it's been something we've kind of learned together. So I'll kind of close out this part and get back to the oral history, except to say what I try to do in my work is to connect archival research with the oral history. And so I won't read you this text here, but this is something I call emancipatory internationalism. This is one of the most exciting things I think that I've been able to uncover, is a tradition where African Americans and Latinos find ways to organize across borders. Sometimes from Mexico, sometimes from Cuba, sometimes from the Dominican Republic, connecting to Philadelphia, connected to New York, connecting to Savannah, to Gainesville, even where I live. And those connections in history are very important. This is a chapter outlined in my new book, and I begin by talking about the Haitian Revolution. Chapter 2 is about the Mexican War of Independence, and again, it's about it's not that I'm saying change U.S. history because we're more diverse now. We've always been diverse. What I'm saying is accept the idea that the influence on this country from Latin America and the Caribbean have been just as decisive as the influences from Europe, and in some cases even more so. And I can take questions on that during Q&A because I want to get back to the oral history part. So my archival research informs my oral history approach. And I think Ruth talked in this a little bit. What we do is we get students out into the field. In oral history, when we talk about field work, it means getting students out of the classroom. We prepare them. You know, I mentioned earlier research, digital production skills, how to use a recorder, make sure you turn on your mic and your recorder. I lost more than one interview that way, forgetting to hit the record button. But students now have such great production skills, it's much easier to teach production than it was. Like, I learned the analog way. And I still use terms that really tickle my students. I still use the term tape. Make sure and don't forget to tape that. And they're like, what? They think it's the funniest thing in the world. I just got our son insisted I get a smartphone. I had a flip phone up until about, my niece is saying yes, until a few months ago. But the digital production skills don't mean much unless you teach the historic context. So getting the students out of their comfort zones into talking, in this case, this summer our summer sessions are divided into 6-week terms. We will have about 20 UF students, most of them who grew up in urban Florida, some in gated communities, but we may have a few who come from migrant labor backgrounds who will be interviewing migrant farm workers about their life experiences. What is it like to pick cucumbers or tomatoes in Florida? What are the working conditions like? What did your parents do in the old country? Do you still keep a connection to the country of origin? And so we get into questions of citizenship. The term civic engagement was brought up in the introduction. And oral history is a great way to encourage students to be involved in the community. You know, and to ask basic questions like, where is your food? Where is our food from? Where does it come from? Why is our produce so seemingly inexpensive compared to many other countries? Why are Florida tomatoes, when you pick them, yellow? How do they get red? That's something that the students will learn in this class. We have a number of different projects, and I consult with oral history programs and projects throughout the country through the Oral History Association. And you can just see here on the left, veterans' histories have always been big for us. Every director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program has been a veteran. Samuel Proctor, our founder, was a World War II veteran. What did he do during the war, you may ask? Probably the most important service activity you could have done during World War II in the U.S. He taught literacy at Camp Blanding, Florida. You may remember, if you read your history, if you had Phil Schaefer, you remember this, that one of the crises at the outbreak of World War II was a shockingly low literacy rate among Americans. You can't fight a modern war with an illiterate Army or Navy or Air Force. So Sam taught literacy for 3 years. Camp Blanding is right down the road from the University of Florida, and I believe that's one of the reasons why he got into oral history. Sam always loved storytelling. He was one of the first Jewish faculty members at the University of Florida. He was a Jewish faculty member at the University of Florida in the early 50s when the UF had a quota against hiring too many Jewish scholars, because you can't have too many Jewish people, right? This is after World War II, after the horrors of Nazism. Sam fought anti-Semitism his whole life. He retired in 1996. He was one of the first faculty members to sign a public statement supporting the civil rights movement in Gainesville, Florida. It was a big deal. He was really a stand-up faculty member. And the Mississippi Freedom Project is where, and this summer I'll be taking a group of about 15 students to the Mississippi Delta to interview veterans of the civil rights movement. You want to talk about excitement? That is excitement. To take, again, students from an urban background into the most rural place in the United States that I've been in, and I've spent a lot of time in South Florida and the Central Valley. But the Mississippi Delta is a world apart. And insofar as, and again in my travels, insofar as people outside of the country know this country's culture, they learn it through the Mississippi Delta. They learn it through, like B.B. King. You know, they learn it through the musicians. They learn it through Richard Wright, great novelist, and other writers. So taking students to the Delta, and in a few minutes I'll show you as I kind of wrap up some of the outcomes of this, the impact that going out and interviewing a World War II veteran or interviewing a civil rights activist and then coming back, transcribing the interviews, editing the interviews, and then thanks to digital production, being able to gather, preserve, and then promote the interview. So when I was in college, I wrote a lot of papers. When I was in graduate school, that's all I did, semester after semester. Now, I have students who can interview a civil rights veteran from the state of Mississippi who was there in Freedom Summer, registering African Americans to vote, dodging bullets, risking their lives. And within 1 week, if that student is well trained, they can produce an audio documentary and put it out there and have an audience of 10,000 people. And that's something that to me, it's still, I'm like, wow, this is incredible. Y'all, this is really incredible. And don't tell me that Americans don't care about history, because they do. We just have to make it, kind of interesting. You'll see other projects. I'm going to talk a little more about the art of aging. You may have heard that Confederate monuments are a big deal again in the South. Yes? Again, don't let anyone tell you Americans are not interested in history. We have a controversy raging in our town. And what I try to do is to help students create research projects that they're interested in, that they really want to push and promote, that bring in volunteers too. Because oral history, when we talk about civic engagement, it's not just about college people going out and educating the community, it's about the community coming and educating us. Oral history is very reciprocal. So for example, the Veterans History Project that we run out of the Proctor program, and I don't have to tell you, I generally don't have millionaires coming into my office like throwing money at me, right? But I don't need to. In my Veterans History Project, like my ace volunteer is an emeritus provost at the University of Florida, right? And I retired faculty. I have the person that directs the Veterans History Project that interviews World War II and Vietnam and Afghanistan and so on. She's a retired nurse. And she has the kind of listening skills and the patience that it really takes to be a good oral historian. a little bit of information. And by the way, this is just taken from the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program website. There on the stage, I didn't pass these out, but you're welcome to take, well, I brought 2 discs. One disc is a documentary that we did several years ago with 4 Bataan Death March survivors. How many of you know about the history, a little bit about the Bataan Death March? Okay, so, I learned about it in college. I even heard people talk about it when I was growing up. But being able to present a documentary with people talking about what it meant to survive and endure the Bataan Death March is pretty incredible. And I remember the night we premiered that documentary, you'll see this gentleman who is being, who's profiled, who did interviews, who's featured in the film, one of the 4 survivors. And if you see the B-roll where we've taken photographs of him in the audience during the screening, you'll notice that he has an IV in his arm and that he's wearing hospital clothes and that he's in a wheelchair. And the reason that Mr. Pepper is in a wheelchair and has an IV in his arm is that his doctor at the VA in Jacksonville forbade him from coming to the screening of this film about his life as a Bataan Death March survivor. And so he had his daughter come and sneak him out of the hospital so he could be there at the premiere. And so that's one of the discs. The other disc is something that I don't have much time to talk about tonight, but it's a performance disc. And it's oral history and performance now are major, it's a major thing. This performance is based on 14 oral history interviews that we conducted with African American elders in Florida who talk about what it was like to grow up in Florida during segregation, what it was like to be a civil rights activist, what's changed, what has not changed, especially at the University of Florida. And so, traditionally you can write a paper about that, you can write a dissertation, you can write a book, but we connected with a playwright at the University of Florida, a world-renowned playwright, Kevin Marshall. And Kevin called me one day and he said, Paul, in your collection of 7,500 oral history interviews, do you have any poignant, powerful, tear-jerker stories told by black people about segregation at the University of Florida? And I said, how many do you want? I have hundreds. And so Kevin ended up picking 14. And he wove the oral history narratives into a script. And we had MFA actors, students going to UF to get their Masters of Fine Arts in theater, in performance, in choreography, what have you, perform these oral history narratives of 14 different University of Florida African American graduates from roughly the mid-60s through the early 70s. It sold out every night it played, every night. Hundreds of people, standing room only. Even our university president showed up. Imagine that. That's when you made history exciting, right? And it was so compelling, and it was very educational for me. I'm not a performer, and I don't have those skill sets, but oral history is profoundly interdisciplinary. And so we're getting into performance more and more and more. Our students, by the way, I just sent a group to Cal State Fullerton, and 11 of them performed the experience that our students had in documenting the 2016 presidential inauguration and the National Women's March on Washington. And the reason we sent a field team of 17 students to those 2 events was the day after the election, the presidential election, a lot of students approached me and said, we want to figure out what's going on in this country. We thought we understood this country, but we don't really understand it. Can we get to DC and talk to people? And they wanted to talk to people who are in groups like Latinos for Trump and street preachers for God, or all sorts of diversity of groups. And my provost asked me about this, and I said, these students want to learn history, but they're tired of watching it from a great distance. They want to go there. They want to be part of history. And why shouldn't they? There were tens of millions of people dialed in on DC for those 3 or 4 days. Why shouldn't our students go there and learn something? out of that. So anyway, one of our performances, they actually just performed this at Cal State Fullerton 2 or 3 days ago, their experiences in doing those interviews. One of my favorite projects called The Art of Aging. And I mentioned earlier, oral history is very interdisciplinary. This is a project, this is a very common kind of oral history project. Most university-based oral history centers do work with College of Medicine if they have a College of Medicine or College of Nursing or College of Social Work. And this project is really cool. This is probably well, maybe you can read that. I can't read it. I don't have my glasses, but this is a cool project because our humanities students train third-year medical students how to do oral histories. And College of Medicine faculty approached me because they said, Paul, we have a crisis in medicine. We can't get our young doctors to specialize in geriatric medicine. They don't think it's sexy enough. They are gravitating towards specialized medicines of different types, right? And we think that the problem is they don't talk to older people, right? They don't see older people as incredible repositories of knowledge and wisdom. They just see like us old people, you know? And so the idea here is to get a third-year medical student paired up with an elder to do a life history interview. No medicine, no medical history involved, just your life history. And this is a project that's working. The medical faculty are so thrilled about this because they're like, we don't know if this is going to, create a revolution yet, but we for the first time in years, we have medical students who say, yeah, geriatrics, that would be cool. I'm considering it, So, and again, oral history as an interdisciplinary craft, a chance for humanities people to join with medicine folks. These are just some of the different research projects. Most oral history centers that do veterans history interviews now, there's a congressionally supported project run out of the Library of Congress. Every oral history that we do with a veteran from whatever theater of war or peace, every one of those interviews we transcribe, we edit, we put online at the University of Florida, make it accessible for students and scholars, but a copy of that also goes to the Library of Congress. The Veterans History Project, again, is a congressional mandate, and it's really cool for our area veterans to know that their life histories, their histories of their military service are going not only in a local repository, but also at the Library of Congress, and eventually the LOC plans to have a physical place where you can actually go and listen to these interviews. It's going to be really, really cool. One of the first people I interviewed for this project is none other than my father, who's here with us, Paul Pedro Ortiz, who's a Marine and Naval retiree. I mentioned iTunes earlier. I don't think I'm going to play any more audio clips for you, but you'll get a sense. How many folks here use iTunes, or what are some of the others in addition to iTunes? There's Spotify, right? We can do this on Spotify too. We chose iTunes to put out a podcast series, and the way it works is, again, our students pick an interview, a story that they think is really cool. And so you can see here, there's just kind of a list. The Addiction History Project is another project. We work with a lot of folks in College of Medicine. You may be familiar with the term opioid crisis. We have interviewed a lot of doctors and a lot of patients and recovering addicts. Queer history is a big project at UF, especially after we only started our queer history project, I'm kind of ashamed to say this, in the wake of the Pulse nightclub massacre 3 years ago. But again, our students said, why don't we have this? We need to have this. And so you can see here, this is just kind of a menu of different stories that our students choose. Theron Hunter, big time in the Brotherhood. We do a lot of labor history. So those of you familiar with labor know that IBEW is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Our students did a project interviewing the first generation of women leaders in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Very interesting project. They pick they pick the topics, they do the interviews, we supervise them, they do the digital production, and once you post this in iTunes, really the sky's the limit. Some of these podcasts, we've charted these, and we can tell you where the subscribers are. Once you subscribe to our podcast, every time we upload a new one, it automatically comes to your smart device, if you have a smart device. We have subscribers from, Beijing, China, from, Johannesburg, South Africa, from Budapest, from Holland, from Argentina, from Mexico City. It's really amazing how people pick up on this internationally, and our students are so thrilled. They can do a project and get an instant sense that, wow, history here really matters. Frank Towers was a person who actually was part of the combat engineer unit that liberated a train of Jewish children that was being sent by the Nazis to a death camp. We were contacted by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel. Do you have any interviews with this incredible person who took part in this liberation and saved 2,000 Jewish children from a death camp? And we said, we have about 10 of them. Which one do you want? We can do another one, because Frank Towers was this incredible storyteller. And one of the things he did was he reconnected with scores of survivors. In other words, he reconnected with many of the children as they became adults. And he would go to Israel or to Europe or to Latin America and actually visit with them. Frank drove at age 96, and he got around everywhere. He went to every one of our public programs. And when he passed away just last year, it was really like losing a friend. Our students wept. They had such a close relationship with him. He was a wonderful story. He always brought his maps with him, and always had records and stuff, and he would get up, and he was the kind of person who you didn't mind. He just got up and he went on and on and on, and you're like, wow, that's cool. What a great story. We live in a society where recently, again, a poll taught us that a very large percentage of Americans no longer even understand what the Holocaust was. Isn't that stunning? But oral history can put us in direct contact with people who remember. So now I'm gonna kind of wrap up here and take some questions in just a few minutes, but first I wanted to show you some of the educational outcomes and how I justify the program to my president and provost is by this, in part, the success of our students. When you get trained in oral history or public history of any kind, you gain a set of skills that I only could have dreamt about when I was in college. Again, you can storyboard, you can create a documentary, you can podcast, you can sit down and carry out a long interview with someone. These skills translate very well into a number of different fields. We have tons of pre-law students. Dan Simone was one of my PhD students, one of my first PhD students at UF, who is the lead curator at the NASCAR Hall of Fame. How cool is that? I mean, race cars. Dan did his dissertation on racing. He interviews race car drivers. I mean, if you're into NASCAR, that's really cool. So Dan has had a very successful career in a very short period of time. Anne-Marie Nichols did a wonderful oral history project on her home county of Jackson County, Florida. And I will try to play this clip of Anne-Marie. Let me see where it's on, 202.45. If I can dial it in here. Because she has a very compelling story. She's talking about going to the University of Florida for the first time as a freshman.
That I was only now learning about the whole truth of the unequal dynamics of class and race that were so intricately woven into Florida history, so tightly connected to the structure of the place I thought I knew so well. It structured my life and the life of every single person I knew. I was angry that people with privilege actively whitewashed local history. They shrouded difficult history from the light, and this darkened public discussion, and in turn, what we knew about ourselves. Most of all, I was angry that African American experiences weren't given equal weight in this narrative. As I reflected on my relationship to my much-loved hometown, cloaked in fertile acres of pines, I began to ask bigger questions. What does it mean to identify with a place? This place? At first, that seems like such a simple question to ask yourself. And then it gets hard. I wanted to know how a person asserted that sense of belonging in a place that doesn't see them as equal members of society, or as their neighbors even. Everything about these questions were tugging at the corners of my soul, because I was rooted there. I loved Jackson County. And as a fifth-generation Floridian with family across the Panhandle, this was the place that made me. So I picked up a recorder and I drove home. I didn't know what else to do. During my time as an undergraduate, I found that studying American history was a way to engage with and better understand my world. When I got an opportunity to enter into the new Oral History Master's program at the University of Florida, I pounced on it. As a scholar, this was a concrete way that I could document the Panhandle, an area of a state that's studied very little, and that's often neglected by most contemporary scholars of the American South and American race relations. Here I was pursuing graduate studies in history 210 miles away, yet I found myself wasting my measly paycheck on gas to return as often as possible. After class on a Monday night, I would hurtle down I-10 West, desperately trying to get back home to the Panhandle of Florida to document the lived experiences of my neighbors. Once there, I called community leaders and teachers who taught me and generations of other Jackson County residents. I knocked on strangers' doors looking for one person, and found another more willing to share stories from their life. I called friends from high school to ask if I could interview their grandparents. My father, the local dentist, told patients about my project while they sat in his dental chair, and found me more than one contact there too. Over the last year, I've spent countless hours on the road, traveling from Gainesville, Florida to Jackson County, traveling back almost every week. In the process, I've collected 15 interviews with community pillars like teachers, public servants, farmers, and individuals whose family have been there for generations. Most of the narrators are African American elders, but interviews vary and also intersect across lines of race, class, and age. In the following 2 podcasts, I will be sharing stories from 5 of the 15 interviews I've collected. These 5 people share a rootedness to the communities they are from in Jackson County. They recount everyday memories of love, community, and farming with mules. They proudly shared stories of houses that grow and vibrant social and spiritual lives that sprang out of their church communities. They describe leaving and returning and the irrevocable change of the communities they grew up in.
So that's Anne-Marie Nichols, one of our best alumnus, who now is the oral historian for Southern Foodways Alliance, which is a nonprofit based in Oxford, Mississippi. Bran, she's also an alumna of our Mississippi field trip, and I think Anne-Marie went on 3 of those. Brianne Palmer did as well. Brianne went on 2 Mississippi field trips, interviewed civil rights activists. And I mentioned pre-law. A lot of pre-law students are attracted to oral history. Brianne matriculated, graduated with honors at UF, and went to Georgetown Law. She passed the bar 2 years ago. She talks a lot about the impact of learning oral history and history and how that's really informed her legal work as a young lawyer practicing in DC. She passed the Maryland bar that gives you reciprocal rights to practice in DC. Aaron Conlon, who was our graduate coordinator, who actually directed oral histories with migrant farm workers for 2 years, is now a professor at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She is also the founding director of Indiana University's Public History program. More and more colleges and universities and campuses see the utility of public history, and again, connecting the campus to the broader community in a very reciprocal way. The way my provost looks at the oral history program at UF is, oh, you all are the bridge builders. That's the term we hear from the central administration. You're the people that go out and learn from people rather than just studying them. You know, that's the sociologist folks. You know, they study people. We learn from them, and that's very true. And so we have a kind of a niche within higher education which we really go with, and which I think is really a strength. I could share with you so many stories of really successful alumni of oral history. Justin Donovan is one of our all-time greatest students. He currently holds a double postdoc at the University of California and also Vanderbilt University. He's also trained, Ruth, as an underwater diver. He actually dives into old slave wrecks. He's an anthropologist, and he actually coordinated our Mississippi trip on a number of occasions. So again, showing that to let you know, if you have to justify this kind of a program, what are some of the outcomes? What are some of the benefits? What are the student payoffs? There's a lot of them. And now I have a very modest proposal for Olympic College. And I hope you will indulge me as an alumni and not take this poorly. But I think Olympic College should get into the business of public history. I've talked to a lot of people here. I mean, you all already do interviews. You have students that do documentary projects here. Why not think about creating a public history program at Olympic College? Other four-year, two-year campuses have these programs. So my proposal, I asked my niece about this beforehand. I said, what do you do? How does a college pay homage to someone who's given 50 years of their life to an institution? Now, my first idea, just name a building after him. That's so academic-y. And my niece was like, what about a program? And I'm like, you're right. And so my suggestion is to think about this and to think about the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program as collaborators in this process. We've helped a lot of programs get started, but to think about doing the types of projects that you know you'd be strong to begin with. So military history, great place to do it. In Gainesville, it's great because we have such a great VA hospital. A lot of veterans retire in Florida. But I know the same thing is true here. We have so many veterans. African American history, understudied in Washington State big time, needs to be highlighted. Yes, the art of aging, locally owned businesses. I am old enough to remember this incredible array of locally owned businesses growing up here in the 70s. And I've been heartened to see in recent years as I've come back, hey, there's some of them coming, but we have an independent bookstore downtown. That's really cool. Where did it come from? What are the challenges of being a small business person? So that's another strong program a lot of oral history programs have is we call Main Street business, projects. In other words, what does it take to be a business person? What was it like to be the first person to open such a store in this part of the county? And so here's just some general ideas or thoughts. I know I've seen histories of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, but I'm talking about bottom-up histories. Like histories of people like my father, histories of the first African-American workers, histories of the first, Puerto Rican foreman. When my father chaired Hispanic EEOC, what was it like to force open and bring the concept of meritocracy to hiring and to end segregation, or to try to end segregation? So there's a lot of different projects. Now, funding, that's a challenge, right? But it's a challenge that can be overcome. And I'll share one last anecdote about funding, then I'll open it to questions, and I apologize, I think I went a few minutes over. But when I was on my way from Santa Cruz to University of Florida, our university development officer called me and said, Professor Ortiz, do you have any projects you think we could find a donor for? This is what development officers are always doing, right? How can we match the interest of the faculty and the students to a potential donor? And I said, you know, I think you have a donor who would be willing to fund a group of students to go to the Mississippi Delta to interview civil rights activists. The development officer responded to me saying, oh, I don't think there'll be much interest in that. And I said, well, here's a 5-page proposal. Just float it out there and see what you come up with. And within 1 week, William DeGrove contacts me and says, how much money do you need to get those students out to the Mississippi Delta? This is a man whose grand uncle was the only man in the Florida State Legislature who supported the 19th Amendment in 1920, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. His name was also William DeGrove. And the idea that he could support students going and interviewing civil rights activists was exciting to him. He's like, how much do you need? So there's possibilities there. So anyway, thank you for being such an incredibly patient audience. Thank you for your formidable patience